Hey everybody, good morning. It is Wednesday of Holy Week. We're checking in each day as we walk through this week, the last week of the incarnation, Jesus' life in the flesh here on earth. We're walking through this last week with him. We've been walking through the Gospel of Mark. Monday and Tuesday, we were in chapter 11. I'm going to skip ahead to chapter 14 today. There's a lot that happens in chapters 12 and 13 when Jesus and his disciples go back to the temple. A lot of interaction there. It's fascinating to read. So if you got some time today, I invite you and encourage you to do that. But we're trying to keep up with the pace of Jesus's week as he goes through this time. And so I'm going to skip to Mark chapter 14 and read about a fascinating interaction that happens. I'm going to try and mind our time. I'm going to try and keep it to about 5 to 7 minutes. I know I keep promising that and I get long-winded. 5 minutes in pastor time is like 10, 12 minutes in real time. So we'll stay focused today. Let's look at Mark 14. It says, now the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread were only 2 days away. Here we've got our timestamp, trying to keep ourselves day-to-day, daily actions here in this last Holy Week, okay? Or in this last week of Jesus' life, what we call Holy Week. So the Passover is 2 days away, and the chief priests and the teachers of the law were scheming to arrest Jesus secretly and kill him. Remember, Jesus has cleared the temple. That's what we saw yesterday, or actually Monday he cleared the temple. Yesterday, Tuesday, they asked him, by what authority do you do this? Turn over everything in the temple. This isn't new. Jesus has been at odds with the temple leaders for some time. He's teaching about how they're misleading the people, not leading them into true relationship, but in the practice of empty religion. And so there's been plenty of contention along the way. This is nothing new, but clearing the temple has kind of been a breaking point. So they're full on in a plot to arrest and kill Jesus. And so you can read more about that again in chapters 12 and 13. So verse 1 tells us they're scheming to secretly arrest and kill him. Verse 2 says, but not during the festival. They decided they weren't going to do it in the festival. We saw how popular Jesus was during the triumphant entry into Jerusalem. So they're not wanting to upset the people. They're looking for a secret plan. Verse 3, while Jesus was in Bethany reclining at the table, remember we've identified Bethany as a satellite city, the place where Jesus and his disciples are staying, going back and forth from Jerusalem to Bethany. It's about a 2-mile trip. And so they're back in Bethany here, and he's reclining at the table at the home of Simon the leper. A woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume. It's made of pure nard. She broke the jar and poured the perfume on Jesus' head. Some of those who were present were saying indignantly to one another, why waste this perfume? It could have been sold for more than a year's wages, and the money could have been given to the poor. And they rebuked the woman harshly. Leave her alone, Jesus said. Why are you bothering her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, and you can help them anytime you want. But you will not always have me. She did what she could. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial. Truly I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went out to the chief priests to betray Jesus to them. They were delighted to hear of this and promised to give him money. So he watched for an opportunity to hand Jesus over. What I want to focus on today is the tale of two people, two very different reactions to Jesus in this situation. We have the woman, Mark just refers to this woman, but John in his gospel identifies her as Mary, the friend of Jesus, recognized in the Gospel of John. And she recognized who Jesus truly was in this moment, and she worships him. Judas recognizes who Jesus wasn't. That's Judas's frustration. Jesus is not who he wanted him to be, and so Judas rejects him. And I want to think about these two people and their very distinct reactions. Here's the reality. Mary and Judas probably both struggled in this moment to understand what was happening. They probably both struggled to understand some of Jesus' teachings. Remember, we've had the disciples openly ask, why do you teach in parables? We can't understand what you're talking about. Mary and Judas were probably both equally confused about some of the things Jesus said and the things that he taught, and were equally challenged about some of the ways he called us to live. So they're both probably wondering equally, why doesn't Jesus just wipe out his opposition? Clearly the opposition is mounting. Part of the reason they're in Bethany is they're hiding. It is viewed as a safe place. They realize the tension in Jerusalem. We've seen in the story of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead that he's clearly aware of the threat on his life. He's foretold them in a prophetic way what will happen. Judas is realized as a zealot, somebody who is deeply interested in the redemption of Israel and the overthrowing of the Roman occupation. But Mary is probably equally wondering, Jesus, with your power and your glory, why don't you just overwhelm your opposition? So equal confusion, equal frustration, probably equal ideas about how things should be done and could be done in a different way. But two very distinct and different responses. Mary recognizes that Jesus is God. And so she responds to her confusion and her frustration and her disappointment with trust and faith and worship. Judas responds to his confusion and frustration and disappointment with rejection. If Jesus isn't going to act the way Judas wants him to act, then he's not going to be the God that he serves and recognizes as God. Friends, let me ask you, when we put our hearts in that condition, who is God? If we have the opportunity and the right to determine if God is acting correctly in a way that we will recognize as godly activity and acceptable godly behavior and godly guidance, then who is truly God? We're making ourselves God. And so let me ask you, when things don't go your way, when you're in a season of confusion or frustration or misunderstanding, who are you? Are you Mary? And do you recognize that even though you might be confused, you might be frustrated, you might be uncertain, you might have your own ideas and plans and agendas about how things should work out, do you trust and worship and praise and move forward in faith even when God isn't acting the way you want, or you perceive God isn't acting the way you want God to act? Or are you Judas? Are we Judas? I'm not trying to point the finger. Are we Judas? And when God isn't acting the way we want God to act, and when we have our own ideas and our own agendas and our own thoughts about how things should turn out, do we just reject God's plan and God's timing and God's purposes? That's a question for us today. We all find ourselves, maybe you're finding yourself now in a season of confusion and frustration. Maybe you've got your own ideas about how things should work out, the way God should be moving and acting, how God should deal with this pandemic, or how God should deal with some situation in your life. And maybe it's appropriate for us to ask ourselves today, how do we respond in our times of confusion and frustration, our misunderstanding, when we have our own ideas, our own agendas? Are we a Mary who trusts that God is God and we are not, and moves forward in faith and hope and worship? Or are we a Judas who takes things into our own hands and comes up with our own plans? We know Judas recognized the error of his ways. I hope we don't have to go through that. I hope that we can learn how important it is to trust God no matter what. Grace and peace. Have a blessed day.